Good morning, afternoon, evening, or night to everyone. This video is the second part dedicated to the topic of how I envisioned the final season of Game of Thrones. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, it is essential to watch it first. Otherwise, you will probably not understand much of what will be discussed in this video. To those who have seen part 1, a huge thank you for your feedback. I must admit, neither I nor my brother expected such a reaction and engagement. So, I will say everything necessary at the end of the video, except for one thing. For obvious reasons, starting from the end of part 1, the plot lines will differ from what we saw in season 8. Selecting clips from the series that more or less match the context is not an easy task. And while we tried to balance this with soundtracks playing in the background, don't forget to use your imagination, because it's impossible to create a better visual than the one you can imagine in your own mind. Try to picture how it all might have looked on the big screen. And now, without further ado, I guess enjoy the watching. The procession of horses and wagons that left the outskirts of Winterfell and headed south had crossed the Moat Cailin. According to legends, Moat Cailin was once a grand fortress of the First Men, consisting of 20 stone towers, of which only 3 remain intact today. Nothing remains of the wooden castle walls, which were once as tall as those of Winterfell. Nevertheless, Moat Cailin was still inhabited and played an important role as a fortified point, defending the north from the south to this day. To the south of the fortress stretched the lands known as the Neck. Along the only dry road lay endless swamps, filled with sucking sinkholes, venomous snakes, and flowers, and the coming winter made the journey south even more treacherous. Tyrion, gazing out the window of the wagon, was lost in thought. His contemplations were interrupted by Varys, who sat beside him. Varys shared his concern that since their departure from Winterfell, they hadn't received a single raven with any news. What was happening at the castle? Had the dead reached the defenders of Winterfell? And if they had their efforts been successful? And had they managed to stop the greatest threat to the living? In his usual manner, Tyrion replied that sooner or later news would reach them, but regardless of the outcome, it was unlikely to be good. If the living won, how many of them are still alive? He said, thinking of his brother. And if the White Walkers did, he continued, it's better to think of something pleasant while we still have the chance. Sam Tarly was also restless. He tried to quell his anxiety by reading an old book he had taken from the Citadel in Old Town. It was a collection of chronicles and ancient tales from various peoples about the Long Night and the hero who ended it. The book recounted the Rhoyna's version, a retelling of the chronology of the Long Night from the sacred scrolls of Yiti, and how a figure named Hyrkoon the hero, armed with the sword Lightbringer, had led the people into battle and dispelled the darkness. The tome also contained the Westerosi version, an old tale of the last hero who sought out the children of the forest to help him where thousands had failed, and prophecies from ancient Ashite texts which described how the hero was to be born again after a long summer. Evil, cold, and darkness would descend upon the land, and Azor Ahai would once again wield the sword Lightbringer to fight the darkness. All these legends seemed useless to Sam, as they lacked facts and were merely loose retellings of events from centuries past. He had come to this conclusion during his journey from Old Town to Winterfell. But, after weeks of research and conversations with Bran Stark, he turned the pages with a new perspective. The inconsistencies in some details were becoming clearer, and Sam noticed common patterns in the legends of different peoples. The book he had initially thought useless now held information that was destined to become key. Voices and shouts were heard. The column slowed its pace. Sansa Stark, opening the door of her carriage, saw 2 dragons flying in the sky. Rhaegal flew with his usual ease, but Drogon's flight seemed labored. The largest of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons landed on the King's Road with a heavy thud. Daenerys jumped to the ground, followed by Brienne of Tarth, Tormund, Theon Greyjoy, and Jorah Mormont. They were barely standing. Their armor was smeared with blood, soot, and dirt. The exchange of news began. When asked what had happened in the battle at Winterfell, Daenerys replied that the capital of the North was lost. Brienne added, in response to Tyrion's inquiries, that part of the forces defending the castle had managed to escape through the southern gates, heading south. As they flew on the dragon, they saw through the blizzard the retreating columns of people, covered from the dead by the Unsullied. But how many had survived the battle, and where the army of the dead was now, they did not know. The news of the defeat of the united forces of the living at the walls of Winterfell echoed through the column. Daenerys, whose thoughts were on Jon Snow, ordered everyone to continue moving towards the twins. She would fly ahead with him, as Jon needed a master's help due to the wounds he had received in the battle. Sansa Stark opposed this decision. She reminded them that Riverrun was still under Lannister control and that they didn't know what was happening south of the twins, nor did they know how far the Night King and the horde of Whites had advanced. The safest place for them now was the Vale of Arryn. The high mountains of the Vale separated this region from the neighboring kingdoms. During winter, the mountain passes were buried in snow, and all communication with the Vale was carried out only by sea. This meant that neither Cersei with her southern allies nor even the advancing army of the dead from the north would be a threat to those in the Vale for some time. Daenerys and the others found Sansa's words reasonable. It was decided that since Sansa was familiar with Robert Arryn, she would travel with Daenerys and Jon on Drogon to the Arryn's winter residence, the Gates of the Moon, and the others would continue their journey to the Twins. Tyrion, as the Queen's hand, would lead the people until her return. Upon arriving at the Twins, they would send ravens to all the castles of Westeros south of the Neck, sharing the news from the north and urging people to move south. With practiced ease, Daenerys climbed onto Drogon. Brienne of Tarth and Jorah Mormont helped Sansa Stark up. She had barely managed to secure her grip when Drogon stood on his legs and with a swift motion soared into the air, flying towards the Gates of the Moon. Shortly after, Rhaegal, who had been circling in the air all this time, joined them. The remnants of the human army, led by Davos Seaworth, Jon Royce, and Jaime Lannister, were slowly making their way through the blizzard. From time to time, small groups of Dothraki survivors who had managed to escape the battle with the giants and find their way south joined them. The men were exhausted, wounded, and broken in spirit. Initially, the wounded and those who could no longer walk were carried on horses, but soon, even the horses began to collapse from exhaustion and die along the march. Some of the survivors, having lost all hope and exhausted their last reserves of strength, abandoned their weapons and wandered off into the darkness, eventually sinking to the snow-covered ground. The commanders, particularly Ser Davos, forced such men to stand, return to the line, and continue the retreat towards Moat Cailin, where they could find shelter and rest. However, the longer they marched, the less effect these words had. Soon, no one spoke a word. Everyone was lost in memories of the battle. The oppressive darkness of the long night, the cold wind mixed with snow, and the threat of the hordes of the dead pursuing them robbed them of all hope. The remaining human army was permeated with hopelessness and despair. Thanks to the speed of the dragons, Daenerys, Jon, and Sansa reached the Arryn's castle within a day. The dragons landed within the fortress walls, and Sansa immediately reassured the castle's defenders by stating her name and title. She requested an audience with Robert Arryn and help for her brother, the king in the north, Jon Snow. The Knights of the Vale helped lift Jon off the dragon's back and carried him into the Gates of the Moon. The commander of the fortress, upon learning from Sansa the reason for their arrival, tried to find out if Jon Royce and the Knights of the Vale, who had gone to aid Winterfell, had survived, but Sansa Stark could not provide an answer. The master of the castle examined the dragon rider's wounds. The injuries Jon had sustained during the battle and from the fall after he leaped at the Night King was serious. While Jon's wounds were being dressed, Sansa questioned Daenerys about the details of the battle. Daenerys explained that she and Jon had seen little of what had happened at the castle walls. She recounted how Jon had risked his life to save her from the Night King. Daenerys also mentioned that after she was forced to flee from the White Walkers, she had again encountered the undead Viserion in the sky. It was then that Viserion's claws inflicted a wound on Drogon, making it difficult for him to fly. Rhaegal had flown to their aid, attacking the undead Viserion, which allowed Daenerys and the injured Drogon to retreat to Winterfell. Flying low over the ground, she had tried to spot Jon Snow in the thick of the battle, but saw only Brienne of Tarth, Jorah Mormont, and Tormund fighting their way through the horde of wights to Winterfell. What had happened to Jon after he leaped from his dragon, she didn't know. She only reported that she was fortunate to see Theon carrying Jon towards the main courtyard. When they flew away, they noticed that for some reason, the others and the dead did not pursue the fleeing people to the south, as if they were distracted by something else. Who managed to survive and who didn't, she didn't know. News of the events in the north quickly spread across Westeros, and within a week after the battle at Winterfell, rumors had reached the shores of Essos and even the free cities, such as Norvos and Qohor. By this time, Jon Snow had already regained consciousness. Beside him, sitting on the bed, was Daenerys. His attempt to stand brought only sharp pain, and Daenerys' hand gently pushed him back down. She asked him what he had been thinking when he jumped from Rhaegal onto the Night King. With a sigh, he replied that he had seen the Night King holding a White Walker spear, which meant that Rhaegal could have been harmed. That was the only clear thought that came to his mind. Jon looked at Daenerys and told her in detail what had happened to him after the fall and what he had seen in the Godswood of Winterfell. His voice sounded as if he was apologizing to her, and Daenerys fully understood what he was thinking. Jon kept replaying one simple thought in his mind. If only he had managed to strike the Night King with Longclaw during the fall, none of this would have happened. Meanwhile, in the Red Keep of King's Landing, Qyburn entered the Queen's chambers. He informed her that Euron Greyjoy's fleet was finally ready to set sail and that the preparations they had discussed were nearly complete. Queen Cersei Lannister seemed unlike herself. The departure, and as she saw it, the betrayal of Jaime Lannister had taken a heavy toll on her. She was drinking so much strong wine that she could now compete with her hated brother Tyrion. However, traces of her former sanity had not completely left her. Gazing out at the city streets, she asked Qyburn if they were making a mistake with their actions. Over a month ago, news had arrived that the wall had fallen. Now, there were rumors that a threat unlike anything humanity had ever faced was moving south, destroying and killing everything in its path. What if they should consider an alliance with the king in the north and the last of the Targaryens, Daenerys? Qyburn, in his usual soft and persuasive manner, replied that all of this was merely the enemy's trickery, and the tales of the others, the fear of the White Walkers, he continued, glancing at the mountain standing in the corner of the Queen's chambers, are nothing more than superstitions and nonsense believed only by common folk. The longer Qyburn spoke, the more clearly madness gleamed in the Queen's eyes. The Hand of the Queen promised Cersei that when Euron Greyjoy returned after fulfilling his part of the plan, he would, with the help of his unique art, inaccessible even to the wisest minds in the Citadel, provide her with something truly magnificent. The Queen, now fully dismissing her doubts, thanked Qyburn for his loyalty, and pouring herself another glass of wine, returned her gaze to King's Landing. By the beginning of the third week of Jon, Daenerys, and Sansa's stay at the Eyrie, a raven arrived at the castle with a message from Tyrion Lannister. The letter stated that part of the army that had survived the Battle of Winterfell had managed to reach the twins. It was time to return. Daenerys Targaryen decided that Jon should remain at the Eyrie for a little longer. Jon Snow, feeling responsible for what had happened, opposed this decision and wanted to join the others at the twins, not wishing to stay behind. However, Sansa Stark managed to reason with her brother. She wisely pointed out that Jon still couldn't stand firmly on his feet, and such a dragon rider would be of little use. More importantly, Drogon was also not fully recovered from the battle. Therefore, Daenerys believed that one of the dragon riders needed to stay here to look after the dragon. Unable to find words to argue, Jon had no choice but to agree with Daenerys' decision. Riding on Rhaegal, Daenerys Targaryen and Sansa Stark arrived at the twins. Tattered banners of various troops were visible on both banks and the castle walls. In the inner courtyard of the eastern castle, the arriving queen and the Lady of Winterfell were met by Grey Worm. Daenerys was glad that her friend and close ally had survived. Together, they headed to the former halls of the Frys, where the heroes had gathered to discuss what to do next. Just as before the Battle of Winterfell, the heroes once again began a council. Along with Grey Worm, Jaime Lannister, Davos Seaworth, and a small group of knights had arrived at the twins. But Daenerys' attention was drawn to a man who remained silent, standing slightly behind the others. He was dressed in a green cloak and was watching her intently. Varys, the only one who recognized him among the commanders who had arrived a few days ago at the twins with the survivors, introduced the stranger to the Queen. He said, "Allow me to present to you Lord Howland Reed, head of House Reed and Lord of Greywater Watch." The name meant nothing to Daenerys, unlike Sansa Stark. She remembered the stories her father, Eddard Stark, had told her about his old friend from the Crannogmen, who had participated in Robert Baratheon's rebellion against the Mad King. Howland was one of the 7 Northmen who went to the Tower of Joy to rescue Lyanna Stark, and he was the only one, aside from Eddard, who survived the fight against the Kingsguard. It was Howland Reed's people, the Crannogmen, who had helped the survivors of the Battle of Winterfell cross the neck. The most severely wounded were taken to Greywater Watch, the ancestral castle of the Reeds. The rest were guided south through the swamps of the Neck by secret paths. The Crannogmen are secretive, short-statured people unlike other northerners. They live reclusively and almost never leave their marshes. According to legend, during the Andal invasion of Westeros, the Crannogmen allied with the Children of the Forest, who intended to stop the invasion and use magic to flood the Neck. The Crannogmen possessed special magic known only to them. Neighbors who often fought with the Crannogmen, such as the Ironborn, the Freys, and the Boltons, despised them for avoiding open battles, preferring instead to shoot enemies with poisoned arrows from ambushes. Attempts to capture the Reed's castle, Greywater Watch, always ended in failure. The invaders couldn't even find it. In the end, they all died ingloriously, disappearing in the swamps and bogs. Howland Reed reported that his people were patrolling the northern outskirts of the Neck and Moat Cailin. The Crannogmen would be able to delay the advance of the army of the dead, leading the Whites into the swamps and quagmires. Even for the others, crossing this region would take some time. Daenerys thanked her newfound ally for the help, though she still felt that Reed looked at her with some suspicion. She then informed the group that Jon and Drogon were forced to remain in the Vale of Arryn for now, recovering their strength. This was crucial information. It meant they could only count on one dragon. After glancing around at everyone present, she posed the primary and key question. What should they do next, and do any of her advisors have a plan? Jorah Mormont spoke first. Their first major problem was that they no longer had an army to fight another battle. The second issue was that they had almost no obsidian weapons and arrows left to fight the army of the dead. Most of their supplies were lost with Winterfell, and extracting new ore from Dragonstone became impossible a few days ago. In response to Sansa's bewildered question of why, Davos Seaworth explained that the Ironborn fleet had laid siege to Dragonstone. If the reports from Dragonstone were true, Euron Greyjoy himself was leading them on his Silence Galley. Daenerys, in a fit of rage, uttered several curses and declared that she would burn Euron's entire fleet, followed by Cersei and King's Landing. Tyrion, after exchanging a glance with Varys, stepped forward and, looking Daenerys in the eye, said that she shouldn't do that. Yes, the situation seemed dire. They had lost the battle against the Night King, but they were not yet defeated. Firstly, the army lost in the north could be rebuilt. Most of Dorne's army was still intact. Secondly, Cersei was losing control of the kingdom with each passing day. Over the past few weeks, they had tirelessly sent ravens to every castle and stronghold that remained loyal to the Iron Throne. Many lords and garrisoned strongholds in the Riverlands and even the Westerlands had started to switch sides, fully convinced of the impending threat. Only the lords of the Reach and Stormlands remained loyal to Cersei, and that loyalty was maintained only by the forces of Euron Greyjoy and the Golden Company that had arrived in Westeros. Grey Worm reminded them that the cities of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen were still loyal to the Mother of Dragons. Additionally, the Second Sons remained in Meereen, maintaining order after their departure to Westeros. The only problem was how to transport mercenaries from Essos. Varys noted that he understood the Queen's anger well, but Cersei and her allies were their enemies, not the city and the people living in it. King's Landing could house the army they would gather to replace the one lost, and the city's outer walls and the Red Keep were among the largest fortifications in Westeros. The Golden Company, the strongest and most renowned group of mercenaries, were loyal not to Cersei, but to the one who sat on the Iron Throne. This must be taken advantage of, he said, stepping aside to give the floor to Tyrion. This is what we will do. Jaime is the only one my sister won't harm and might still listen to. He will go to King's Landing and convince Cersei to relinquish her claim to the Iron Throne, finally ending this pointless war. In the meantime, the only one who can lift the siege of Dragonstone is you on Rhaegal, but the fleet mustn't be burned entirely. We need to preserve as many Ironborn ships as possible. You'll have to face the entire armada alone and kill Euron Greyjoy. If he dies, Yara Greyjoy will rightfully become the next candidate for the Seastone chair. By gaining control over the remaining Ironborn fleet, we can resume the supply of obsidian to King's Landing and transport mercenaries from Essos. If we manage to defeat Euron Greyjoy and convince Cersei to relinquish the Iron Throne, we will capture the capital of the Seven Kingdoms without spilling a drop of blood. And if we succeed in all this, our final step to unite the Seven Kingdoms against the common enemy will be your coronation as the new Queen of the Iron Throne, Tyrion Lannister concluded, explaining their plan to Daenerys Targaryen. Then, as if gathering his courage, he quietly but confidently said, "And Jon Snow as Prince Consort." Silence fell over the room. Jorah Mormont and Grey Worm's faces were tense. Davos Seaworth and Brienne of Tarth glanced at Sansa Stark, who was processing everything she had just heard. The only ones who maintained a semblance of impartiality were Varys and Howland Reed standing beside him. Finally, after considering Tyrion's words, Daenerys asked on what grounds Jon had a claim to the throne. Sam, who had been nervously shifting from foot to foot, placed a book containing the records of High Septon Maynard, found in the Citadel, on the table. He pointed Daenerys to the entry, where it was recorded that the Septon had annulled Prince Rhaegar's marriage to Elia Martell, and then, in Dawn, the prince had entered into a new secret marriage with another woman. This woman, according to the entry, was Lyanna Stark. Howland Reed, who had been carefully watching Daenerys the entire time, said that he had been at the Tower of Joy when Lyanna Stark gave birth to a child she named Aegon Targaryen, after Aegon the Conqueror. Eddard Stark, knowing the nature of his friend Robert Baratheon, decided to protect the child from Robert's wrath and passed the boy off as his own bastard, naming him Jon Snow. Jon's ability to ride a dragon indicated the presence of Targaryen blood in him. Taking into account the records found by Sam in the Citadel, and his readiness to testify as one of the lords of Westeros about Jon's parentage, the king in the north had the right, as the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, to claim the Iron Throne by direct lineage. Tyrion turned to his queen again, saying that their task was to unite all the lords of Westeros and the Seven Kingdoms. Jon was a Stark through his maternal line, one of the most respected and ancient houses of the realm. Jon, as Prince Consort, would symbolize the union between the North and the Targaryens, uniting under one crown the ancient houses and kingdoms that had long warred with each other. This union would strengthen their claim to the Iron Throne and ensure stability in Westeros, which was now more necessary than ever to face the common threat. Tyrion paused, then continued in a soft yet firm tone. You and Jon must rule together as equals to ensure peace and unity in the kingdom. Daenerys lowered her eyes, pondering what she had just heard. She understood that Tyrion's proposal, though unexpected, might be the only chance not only for the throne, but for a future where Westeros could survive. So it shall be, she finally said. Later that same day, Jaime, after bidding farewell to the others, rode off to King's Landing with a small escort. 2 days after his departure, Daenerys mounted her dragon Rhaegal and headed east towards Dragonstone. Tyrion and Sansa remained at the Twins, preparing their forces for the impending march south. The sentinels at Moat Cailin and the crannogmen patrolling the Neck noticed the weather worsening with each passing day, and the snowstorm grew more intense. Visibility decreased, and at night the fog became so thick it felt almost tangible. These signs pointed to one inevitable conclusion. The army of the dead would soon strike and continue its march against the world of the living. When the Night King's army reached the northern borders of the Neck, those who had been forced to stop at the Greywater Watch under the leadership of Jon Royce began retreating south. Not long before, he had received a raven from Sansa Stark at the Twins detailing their next moves. But instead of chasing after the main army heading to King's Landing, Jon Royce decided to head to the Vale of Arryn. The time the wounded had spent recovering at the Greywater Watch was not enough for them to endure a long, intense march to catch up with the army that had set out from the Twins toward King's Landing. Royce reasoned it would be wiser to take refuge behind the Mountains of the Moon in the Vale, and then, after gathering the remaining knights and men, retreat to Gulltown from where they could sail to King's Landing on the ships captured from Euron Greyjoy. The few weeks spent in the Vale under the care of the Maesters had allowed Jon Snow to fully recover, and he spent most of his time outside the castle walls, watching over Drogon and waiting for Daenerys and Rhaegal's return. Like Jon, the largest and strongest of Daenerys' dragons was gradually regaining his strength. As he watched Drogon fly, Jon recalled Daenerys' words. Before she left with Sansa for the Twins, she had told him that Drogon had always been different from Rhaegal and Viserion. As Drogon grew, his behavior became more willful. Yes, he had never harmed her, but there were moments when he refused to obey. She had asked Jon not to do anything foolish and not to attempt to ride him. In the first few days, Jon was very cautious. Drogon was far larger than Rhaegal, and his size was intimidating. But a few days after Daenerys and Sansa had left the Vale, Jon decided to approach Drogon. He wasn't entirely sure what drove him at that moment. Carefully, step by step, he moved closer to the dragon, who watched him intently, his growl growing louder. But when Jon's hand touched Drogon, the dragon went quiet. Jon didn't know why, but he didn't feel any danger around the dragon. On the contrary, standing beside him, he felt calm, as if this were an old loyal companion he hadn't seen in many years. And Jon felt that this sense of familiarity was mutual. A small contingent led by Jaime Lannister finally reached the outskirts of King's Landing. As they approached the Dragon Gate, located in the northern part of the city, Jaime noticed many siege weapons mounted on the walls. Dozens of scorpions on wooden platforms had been set up along the walls and towers of the city. The area around the Dragon Gate was in chaos. For some reason, people wishing to leave the city were not being allowed through the gate. In addition to the city guard, soldiers of House Lannister and mercenaries from the Golden Company were stationed at the gate. As he pushed his way through the crowd, Jaime managed to catch the eye of one of the guards, who noticed Jaime's distinctive golden hand. The Lannister soldiers escorted the arriving group to the Red Keep. Within the fortress walls, Jaime and his men were met by Cersei's royal guard. Surrounding them in a semicircle, the guards ordered the newcomers to drop their weapons. Jaime and the others had no choice but to comply. Then 2 of the guards ordered Jaime to follow them. The royal guard led Jaime to the Queen's chambers. It had been just over 2 months since he had left King's Landing, answering the call of Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen. But upon seeing his sister again, he was shocked by how much she had changed in such a short time. Cersei asked why he had returned. Wasn't he now with those they had considered their enemies, the Starks and the Targaryens? Jaime was taken aback by her words. He asked Cersei if she understood what was happening, if she knew where he had just come from and what he had seen. How could they still be discussing who marched under which banners? Cersei, as if not hearing a word Jaime had said, her eyes filled with malice and venom, replied that such thoughts were only for those trying to preserve their house's legacy.
This isn't about noble houses. This is about the living and the dead.
And I intend to stay amongst the living.
Jaime knew his sister better than anyone, but he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He tried to reason with her, saying that no one could face the White Walkers and their horde of whites alone. He described how he had seen from the walls of Winterfell the dead overwhelming the Stark soldiers, the Knights of the Vale, and the Unsullied, how they, undeterred by any obstacles, broke through the defenses, gathering in a chaotic mass beneath the castle walls, and how thousands of other whites climbed over them, scaling the walls and killing everyone in their path. If they did not stop this senseless struggle over who would sit on the Iron Throne, they were all doomed. Cersei shook her head and replied that if it was all so meaningless, then she would keep the throne for herself. Taking a few steps away, she added that she was willing to forgive his betrayal if he swore loyalty to her. Otherwise, he would be charged with treason.
Treason?
Disobeying your queen's command, fighting with her enemies, what would you call it?
You've lost your mind, Jaime quietly said. Cersei called out to the Mountain. She ordered him to imprison Jaime Lannister in the dungeons of the Red Keep, where he would await execution for breaking his oath. And the soldiers who had arrived with Jaime were hanged on the fortress walls as a warning to others. Dragonstone was surrounded by dozens of ships with black sails. Some of the Ironborn vessels were so close to the shore that they risked running aground. Siege engines were mounted on their bows, firing at the lower fortifications of the castle. On the sandy beach, the burning remains of ships which had recently been transporting freshly mined obsidian to the port of White Harbor could still be seen. Euron Greyjoy, already bored after a few days, stood on the deck, wondering if he should send some of his men to storm the castle. Of course, they wouldn't succeed, but the spectacle might be amusing. The idea seemed good to him. He turned to check the position of the sun to gauge how much time was left before sunset. Euron looked around frantically trying to spot the second dragon, but it was nowhere to be seen. A crooked smile spread across Euron's face. This might be easier than he had thought. Daenerys noticed the familiar ballistae mounted on the bows of the ships. One by one, the machines aimed in her direction. Even through the rushing wind, she heard the clatter of metal strings and then saw dozens of arrows flying toward her. She shouted left. Rhaegal, spreading his wings wide, sharply changed his flight path, dodging the barrage. Another arrow whizzed by, just a meter away from Daenerys. Another volley came from the other group of ships right in front of her. Rhaegal, diving downward as if to avoid an attack, flew sharply between the ships, skimming just above the water's surface before climbing back up again. Daenerys carefully scanned the galleys. Euron Greyjoy had positioned his ships in groups so that they could cover each other's sectors. Attacking one group would make her an easy target for two others. Circling around the Tower of Dragonstone, Rhaegal began to descend again, rapidly gaining speed. The Ironborn's advantage was in their numbers. Hers was in speed and maneuverability. Daenerys began weaving between the ships, provoking them to fire. Upper, to the side, up again. Daenerys and Rhaegal circled around the ships, at times moving closer, then quickly closing the distance. They stretched Greyjoy's defenses. Another volley. This was the moment. One of the groups lost its formation. To the onlookers, it might have seemed that the dragon was retreating to gain altitude. But Rhaegal, after maneuvering and suddenly changing direction, attacked. The ships burst into flames. Sailors on deck, caught in the fire, started jumping into the water. Those who did not perish immediately began to drown under the weight of their armor. Euron ordered his ships to regroup, but due to the smoke billowing from the burning vessels, some captains on nearby ships didn't see the command. The fleet began to lose its formation. Some tried to turn back, others continued to follow the order. Visibility dropped. A dragon's roar filled the air, and a stream of fire hit several ships at once. Daenerys broke through the fleet, clearing the way to the Silence. After a circular maneuver, dodging another arrow, she unleashed flames upon Greyjoy. Some Ironborn ships tried to flee. Daenerys chased down those that had already sailed a few miles away and quickly set them ablaze. The captains and sailors on the surviving ships, seeing this and realizing they couldn't escape, steered their vessels toward Dragonstone. If they remained at sea or tried to flee, they faced death either by fire or by drowning. Many of the Ironborn were not yet ready to meet the drowned god. When most of the survivors reached the shore, Daenerys and Rhaegal landed on the beach. By that time, the forces that had been sheltering in the castle, watching the battle, opened the fortress gates and joined their arriving queen. Following the plan, Daenerys addressed the survivors, offering them a chance to join her. But while she was speaking, Euron climbed aboard one of the burning galleys. He had managed to shed his armor in the water and reached the deck of a ship that hadn't sunk yet. The waves had carried the vessel closer to the shore, and on its bow stood a still functioning ballista. Daenerys, still seated atop Rhaegal, and watching as Yara Greyjoy addressed the people, heard a whistle. A 2-meter-long arrow flew under Rhaegal's wing, and its steel tip pierced his hind leg. Greyjoy laughed. Rhaegal roared. Kicking up a cloud of dust, he took off with Daenerys. Euron Greyjoy, having survived the initial attack, leaned back in his seat and watched the dragon approaching him. He had always aspired to great deeds that would be remembered in legend. To die fighting a dragon, that is a worthy end, he thought, just as Rhaegal unleashed a torrent of fire upon him. Jaime Lannister, imprisoned in the Red Keep's dungeon, heard the sound of approaching footsteps. The door opened and Bronn stepped inside. He gave Jaime a short nod and remarked that he and Tyrion now had more in common. Jaime expressed surprise that Bronn hadn't already fled King's Landing. The former sellsword replied that the option was still on the table. The question was whether it made any sense. He asked Jaime if it was possible to escape the dead by crossing the narrow sea. Jaime just shrugged. Leaning against the wall, Bronn continued, saying he had a good idea why Jaime had come to the city, and since he was here, it meant his attempt to reason with his sister had failed. The capital was still in the hands of Cersei and Qyburn, and they wouldn't surrender the city without a fight. Jaime countered that they had 2 dragons, and the city would fall regardless. Bronn warned him not to be so sure. Qyburn and his men had placed wildfire beneath the streets of the city. If the tide began to turn against them, or if the dragons approached the Red Keep's walls, they could burn the city to the ground, with everyone trapped inside. "They won't surrender," Bronn said. "I don't know what's driving them, but they'd rather burn alive with everyone else than give the city to the Dragon Queen." Jaime, barely listening, insisted that his sister wouldn't do that. Bronn shot back, reminding him of what happened to the great Sept of Baelor. Jaime fell silent. Bronn then mentioned that he could still flee to Essos. He had enough gold to disappear far to the east beyond the Bone Mountains and live for a few more years until the dead found a way to cross to the other continent. Or he could free Jaime. He'd help him stop Qyburn and Cersei before the army moving from the Twins reached the walls of King's Landing. In return, Jaime would give his word that once Daenerys Targaryen arrived in the city with her dragons, he'd vouch for him. And for his assistance and contribution to saving 500,000 lives, he and Tyrion would convince the new queen to make him the Lord of the Reach and give him Highgarden. Understanding there was no other way, Jaime said, "You have my word." Meanwhile, far to the north, the sound of a signal horn echoed over the walls of the Bloody Gate. The defenders of the Vale couldn't comprehend how it had happened so quickly, but the snowy haze on the horizon, unnaturally changing direction and rapidly approaching the fortress walls, could mean only one thing: the dead were already on their way. The Knights of the Vale and the forces from Greywater Watch under Jon Royce's command took their positions. From the castle walls, they saw hundreds of the dead emerging from the forest. Within minutes, the hundreds turned into thousands. By the time the defenders were in place, the dead had already reached the outskirts of the Gates of the Moon. Shouts rang out, drowning the commands of sergeants and officers who insisted that the White Walkers couldn't be stopped. The garrison had too few arrows with obsidian tips, and only every second man had a blade made of dragon glass. Jon Royce ordered the oil barrels to be prepared for dropping. Suddenly, someone on one of the towers shouted about the approach of a dragon. Jon, mounted on Drogon, flew along the snowy cliffs and swiftly dived down. A torrent of blazing fire crashed onto the dead, splitting them into 2 groups. Jon directed Drogon to the top of one of the towers, knowing that the castle's defenders lacked the manpower and obsidian to hold back the dead. He knew the Night King was nearby, hiding in the blizzard on the undead Viserion. Jon intentionally hovered above the walls, making himself and Drogon vulnerable. His plan worked. In the sky to his right, Jon noticed a rapidly approaching shadow. Drogon, sensing the danger, soared upward. Jon drew Longclaw and prepared for battle, but the Night King chose a different target. A stream of magical blue flame struck the gates, shattering them. Stone blocks melted, metal grills burst apart, and the dead surged into the fortress. Jon attacked the Night King atop Drogon. Drogon, as if seeking vengeance for the defeat in the north, unleashed a series of powerful blows with his mighty claws. At Jon's command, Drogon flipped over and dove forward. Jon swung his sword, aiming for the enemy's head. It felt as though he had struck a stone. What had happened? He had seen the Night King shatter into pieces of ice when Arya stabbed him in the Godswood of Winterfell. Drogon plunged downward. Upon landing, he turned to face the pursuing Night King. Inside Viserions maw, blue flames began to build. Letting out a furious roar, Drogon crouched, then unleashed a stream of scorching yellow fire at his foe. Neither Jon nor the Night King noticed another dragon approaching from the south. Daenerys, having secured Dragonstone and resumed ore shipments several days ago, was flying to the Vale to Jon Snow. Recognizing the telltale signs of the white cold that accompanied the dead, she understood what was happening. From a distance, she spotted the battle in the sky, grabbed the obsidian spear she had taken from Dragonstone, and hurled it at the Night King, striking him in the chest as Rhaegal clamped his jaws around Viserion's neck at tremendous speed. Once again, Jon heard a sound like cracking ice. Neither Valyrian steel nor obsidian could harm the Night King. Mounted on Drogon, Jon drew level with Daenerys, who was flying on Rhaegal, and shouted that they needed to retreat. Both riders dove down, evading Viserion's attack. Gaining speed, they began their retreat southward. The Night King pursued them for a short while before slowing down and turning back toward his unstoppable army, which was assaulting the gates of the moon. In King's Landing, Bronn and Jaime walked through one of the castle's secret tunnels. Jaime wondered aloud what their chances were, just the two of them. Bronn replied that with a fighter like him, not much. Luckily, there were three of them. Bronn told Jaime that during the days he spent in the dungeon, Sandor Clegane, better known as the Hound, had also arrived in the capital. The Hound had survived the Battle of Winterfell and, with a small remnant of the army, made it to the Neck. But he didn't stay there long and headed to the Twins. There, he learned from Gendry, Robert Baratheon's bastard, that Arya Stark had died in battle. The Hound refused to believe it, but Gendry said that Theon Greyjoy had seen it with his own eyes. Deserting the army, he headed to King's Landing to kill Queen Cersei and the Mountain, the people Arya didn't have time to cross off her list. The city was preparing for a siege. Seizing the right moment, the Hound managed to sneak through the city walls at night. As he searched for a way into the Red Keep, he happened upon Bronn, Tyrion Lannister's former sellsword. When Bronn learned the reason for the Hound's arrival, he agreed to lead him into the castle. At the exit of the tunnel, the Hound was waiting for Jaime and Bronn. They had to act quickly and decisively. The three of them reached the throne room. There they found Cersei, Qyburn, the Mountain, and a few more royal guards still loyal to the Queen. Qyburn reacted first, ordering the guards to kill the traitors to the throne. A fight broke out. The Hound crossed blades with his undead brother, while Jaime and Bronn fought their way to the throne. Realizing the situation was dire, Qyburn began to back away towards one of the doors at the rear of the throne room. Bronn noticed this, swiftly cut down a guard, and chased after him. Jaime, having defeated the last guard, looked at Cersei. His sister, the woman he once loved, now seemed like a stranger. In her eyes, he saw a madness that reminded him of Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King, whom he had killed so many years ago. But on that day, he was certain of his decision, whereas now... The death of Tywin Lannister, the betrayal of the High Sparrow, the humiliation she endured walking naked through the streets of the city, the deaths of Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, and his own betrayal, all of it had broken her mind and spirit. She was no longer the woman he had once loved. Cersei stood by the throne. Rage ignited in her eyes. She lunged at Jaime, screaming that he had betrayed her like everyone else. Jaime took one final step forward, and his blade plunged into her chest. Her eyes widened. She tried to speak, but blood spilled from her mouth. Meanwhile, the Hound, furiously battling the Mountain, managed to knock the sword from his brother's hand. Stepping aside and swinging his sword, he cleaved the Mountain's head from his shoulders. Bronn, having caught up with Qyburn, returned to the throne room just in time to see Jaime gently lowering Cersei's body to the floor. His face was contorted with pain, but he knew it had to be done. The next morning, the army from the Twins reached the city walls of King's Landing. Daenerys and Jon, having flown in on their dragons after the battle with the Night King, landed within the walls of the Red Keep. After Cersei's overthrow, no one in the city was willing to fight. Daenerys thanked Jaime Lannister for fulfilling his duty and once again saving King's Landing and its people. A few days after Cersei's death, Daenerys Targaryen, after 10 long and arduous years of exile in Essos, was crowned as the new Queen of the Iron Throne. Jon Snow, as Aegon Targaryen, was declared Prince Consort. The kingdom was united. One army, one goal, to defeat the dead and the Night King. As the heroes gathered in the chambers of the small council, discussing the battle at the Gate of the Moon and the Night King's invulnerability, Sam cleared his throat to draw their attention. In his hands he held a scroll, one that Theon had retrieved from the Godswood, containing Bran Stark's notes about a ritual that could create Lightbringer. So, that's how it is. I hope that those who were waiting for part 2 were not disappointed by this continuation. Just in case, let me remind you that I'm sharing the version of events that came to my mind. I'm fully aware that some moments don't align perfectly with the spirit of the series, but I personally wanted something like this. What particularly disappointed me in Season 8 was Jaime Lannister's storyline. It was a total character assassination. To annihilate the character development like that, they really had to try. And of course, what made me ask myself, what the hell is going on? More than once was that the final season focused more on Cersei than on the Night King, even though by any logic it was Cersei who should have been the stumbling block. The confrontation with her and Qyburn should have been a secondary task, but if you rewatch the series now, it turns out that the Night King and the White Walkers caused them far less trouble than Cersei in the end. Now, regarding the final part, we had a slight miscalculation with the release date of the second one. I was hoping we would make it by the 22nd to 24th, but the video ended up coming out a week later, as I can't say for sure when we can release part 3. Firstly, as you may have noticed, the channel has the words cinema and games, and the first video was dedicated to the game named Elden Ring. A couple of weeks ago, I finished playing one RPG. I liked it. It's become a big surprise for me, and I want to make a video about it. And from a technical standpoint, making a video about this game is easier than working on Game of Thrones. Yes, I write the script, choose the materials, and visualize in my head how it all should look in the end for the viewer, but it is my brother who can beautifully edit it all together. It would take me 5 times as long as it takes him. And here we come to the secondly. He is starting his final year of high school in September, so he will have less time to help me now. Therefore, I don't know what will come out first, the video on that game or the Game of Thrones video, but it will be either mid-September or the end of the month, maybe with a delay of a couple of days. And that's all for now. I hope those who were waiting for the continuation were not disappointed. If so, you can leave your feedback. Liking the video and subscribing to the channel would be greatly appreciated, as it helps with the video's promotion and the channel's growth overall. And for now, I wish you all a good morning, day, evening, or night. Till next time.